In 1966, Jaguar was looking to work on a replacement for its E-Type, which at the time was about 5-6 years old. The brief was to produce a car which was an evolution of the E-Type itself, something that was aerodynamically stupendous, something that was a phenomenal grand tourer, and that's where it was going to differ from the E-Type, because the replacement was less of a sports car and more of a grand tourer. It started work on the project called XJ21, which was initially a direct evolution of the E-Type coupe itself. William Lyons brought in an aerodynamicist. His name was Malcolm Sayer, and he had produced some designs, some of which went into full-sized models of the XJ21, and the beginnings of what was to come could already be seen. In 1968, the project that was being worked on, called XJ4, came into production, and that was called the XJ6, which had replaced pretty much all the previous saloons beforehand. Malcolm Sayer approached Lyons and said, look, instead of building the XJ21 on an existing car, why don't we use the platform of this new car? He had decided that aerodynamics were the most important aspect of all for the car. Lyons ummed and ahed, but agreed. And so by 1969, Project XJ27 was born, and XJ21 was put on the shelf. XJ27 was going to utilize a radical new body design, which Malcolm Sayer penned. Sadly, Malcolm Sayer died very young in 1970 at the age of 53, and he never saw his creation come to market. Considering that we were in the early days of British Leyland, with all the financial constraints that it had, the XJS was allowed to continue with its progress relatively untouched and unscathed. It would use the existing 5.3 litre V12 that was in the E-Type Series 3. And in September of 1975, the car was unveiled. The design was, at the time, and still is to some eyes, extraordinarily controversial. It was completely unlike the car that it replaced, which Enzo Ferrari had once described as the most beautiful car in the world. This car was edgy. It had ovoid headlamps. It had a very low, sleek design, but most of all, it had flying buttresses, rather like what you would see on a cathedral. Now, unlike a cathedral, those buttresses were filled in, they weren't open, but they were there nonetheless, and it was probably the most controversial aspect of the car. The car was good for well over 150 miles an hour, and this car was designed to take people, young couple, and their luggage across Europe in style to places like Saint-Tropez and Biarritz. It featured in television as well, notably in The Return of the Saint, as well as in The New Avengers. The car was a hit, despite the fact that it had abysmal fuel consumption. And to address that, in 1981, Jaguar produced a high-efficiency version of the engine, and that ran all the way through until the early 90s. However, to address fuel efficiency concerns, Jaguar had been working on a new 6-cylinder engine since the mid-70s that was originally designed to go into the forthcoming XJ40, the car that took Jaguar 14 years to actually get to market. That engine was the AJ6, and it was initially produced in a 3.6 litre form, which went into the XJS here. Now, those engines would become more prevalent in the XJ40 itself, But in 1990, Jaguar had been bought by Ford, and the first thing that Ford wanted to do with Jaguar was to give the aging XJS a bit of a facelift, which it did. That facelift cost over £5 million, and it was given revised bumpers. It was given a revised window line with flush windows and pillarless doors. But inside it was also given new instrumentation. Gone were the old drum instruments, and in their place basically the instrument panel from the XJ40 itself. And then in 1993 this version of the XJS was unveiled, and it was really modernised, along with the rear lights which had appeared in 1991. It now had these big new composite bumpers front and rear, which gave it a more up-to-date look. This is my XJS. It is the 4-litre AJ6. The 4-litre replaced the 3.6 in 1991, produces about 245 horsepower. It's a dual overhead cam unit as well. I've had this car now for about 6 years, and I've had some work done to it which we'll talk about while we're driving, but it's in British Racing Green, and that's the colour you can't beat, isn't it? It's got a beige leather interior as well, and I know that there are some YouTubers out there that really like that. But this is its inaugural driving day for 2024. So I thought I'd make a video about it. I'm Darren Walker, and this is Auto Atlantica. So, this particular XJS is a 1994 model, so well into the Ford years by then, and these post-1993 cars are widely regarded as basically the best of the 21-year production run. So this car was in production between 1975 and 1996. They built over 115,000 of them, but even though this is arguably the best of the series, these post-1993 cars, they're also some of the most difficult to find as well, and that's probably the reason why. Most of the XJSs that were brought into the States overall, and especially of this generation, were convertibles. In fact, the convertibles outnumbered the coupes by about 12 to 1. I'll bring the actual numbers up on the screen, but the coupes themselves are extremely rare. In 1994 and 1995, only some 370 examples of the coupe were actually imported. Despite all the changes by Ford, and after the 1991 facelift, that's when most of the changes were made, i.e. this instrument cluster that you see, which is essentially straight out of the XJ40, but the rest of the car inside is essentially the same. One of the things that I like about the interior are these nifty little lights that you get on the visors. Those are the front lights, by the way. There's also some in the doors that are courtesy lights, and then some at the back as well. As far as the work that has been done to this car, the first thing I had done when I got the car, it had a heater core that was leaking. Someone had patched it up, but then it blew quite quickly in very hot weather after I bought the car. You can actually see where it's been leaking because it's all over the passenger mat. I had no trouble with the car at all after that, and then a couple of years ago I noticed that the thermostat housing was leaking coolant, so I decided to get the entire cooling system replaced because I didn't know when it was last done. It was likely original anyway. So with the exception of the radiator and the exception of the expansion tank, I had all of the hoses replaced right up to the heater core. I had the thermostat replaced as well, and the housing. We just did the lot. I also had the valve cover gaskets replaced at the same time because they had been leaking a little bit of oil. The mechanic that did that work said at the time that it was the cleanest 30-year-old engine that he'd ever seen. We had it polished up because the cosmetics on this car are not the best. So we just brought it up to snuff a little bit, and some of the paint was faded, so we got that out. I think that this car is perhaps going to need a repaint. I'm not sure yet, I'm on the fence about it. The one thing that it does need, there's a couple of issues that it's got. There's some worn bushes on the steering rack. It tends to be a little bit woolly. It is nothing like as sharp as my XJ Sovereign, for instance. But cosmetically is where we've got more problems. It has some rust on the roof above the rain channel, and that has leaked at some point down over the passenger side flying buttress, and it's lifted the paint. I don't know how bad it is, but all that glass is going to have to come out, and the rain gutters themselves, and that all needs to be taken back and redone. There's still a lot of work to do, but mechanically it is up to snuff. I could do with a new battery, and the battery that's in this thing is not the proper size for an XJS, so I am going to replace that this year. But overall, this car, it's got 80,600 miles on it. In the 6 years that I have had the car, it is done about 1,200 miles. As with all of my Jaguars, the anti-lock brake light is on. That is likely just a dirty sensor, and since I don't use this on a daily basis, that is the least of my problems. The ZF gearbox, which was in the 6-cylinder versions, shifts very precisely. There's no issues with it. It's not harsh at all, so no issues with the gearbox at all. The 12-cylinder models, incidentally, had a General Motors gearbox. This car is a delight to drive. It really does make you feel very special. When I was growing up, the XJS was one of my dream cars. I never thought that I would ever own one, but then again, I never thought that you could buy them for the $2,800 that I bought this one for. And I've lucked out with it. Consider I've had some problems with it, but at that price point, an XJS can cost you a whole hill of money more. This one was in a collection originally. An old guy owned it and he died, and his collection was paired out, and a friend of mine ended up owning this car. But I've got a real soft spot for it. I've always liked the facelift models in particular. The smoked rear lights are one of my favourite features about it. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might be asking, why hasn't this car got the 4-round headlights of the American models? Well, they were mandated originally because until 1984, cars in the United States had to have 2 7-inch seal beams or 4 5 3/4-inch seal beams. In the late 70s, rectangular seal beams were allowed as well, but we'll brush over that. But these ovoid headlights, called Corellos, were always prominent on the European cars from the word go. They ended up on the Canadian cars in the late 80s, but it wasn't until the facelift of 1991 that the US versions had them. And because of the beam pattern is different in North America, these aren't glass like the European ones either. They're plastic, and so they do get sun damage and they turn yellow after a while. So I think I'm going to call it a day from my 1994 Jaguar XJS. It's an unusual car. In many ways you feel a bit like the Pink Panther, because you've got this enormous hood, an enormous trunk, and then a little bit to squeeze your posterior in between. It's a car that I personally think is beautiful, and one that I really would like to bring totally up to snuff. So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and do please consider liking and subscribing. It will help my channel in the long run. I'm Darren Walker, and this is Auto Atlantica.